Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday evening, November 9th. This is the Week 13 announcement for Political Science 3753 Constitutional Law, Fall 2025. Everybody, let me take just a few minutes to run through what we're going to be doing for the rest of the term as we are coming close to the end of the term more quickly than you might think. This week, the week of November 10th, we have on the syllabus freedom of religion, and that includes the class notes for lectures 23 and 24. Okay. Now, the following week, the week of November 17th, that's the last week of regular classes before the Thanksgiving break. Okay. So the week of the 17th, we will begin with equal protection issues, 14th Amendment issues, largely racial discrimination issues. Okay, and we will begin that the week of November 17th. Now there's a total of 3 sets of class notes, 25, 26, and 27. The lecture 27 notes are yet to go up on the course website. I will be working on those before Thanksgiving. That will be up on the website before Thanksgiving. So we will begin that the week of the 17th, and then lecture 27 class notes will be the only thing on the syllabus for the week of December 1st, which is the last week of the term before final exams. Now, we have a quiz scheduled for this week on Thursday, and you're asked to take a look at 2 articles about the Mahmoud versus Taylor case, which is the very last thing discussed in the class notes for lecture 24. You're asked to look at 2 pro and con, shall we say, articles about that case. And we'll take a 10-item true-false quiz about that on Thursday. Then there will be a discussion related to freedom of religion next week, the week of the 17th, when we will be beginning on equal protection and racial discrimination issues. Okay. And when we come back from Thanksgiving for the week of December 1st, which is the last regular week of school, we will have a discussion and a quiz that week related to equal protection issues. Okay, and that will do it for our quizzes and discussions for the term. Let me remind you once again, everybody, according to the syllabus, to be on the A track for the course, you must submit a term paper. You must submit a term paper to be eligible to make an A. So I hope you will be in touch with me about that if you would like to write a term paper before the Thanksgiving break. You should have, it was sent out early in the term, a Microsoft Word file with a few pages of Supreme Court cases that we suggest as potential topics for our term paper. So take a look at that. It is up on the course website as well as attached to an email that went out early in the term. If somehow you can't find that, contact me, but it should be attached to an email you have received, and it is up on the course website. So please don't forget about that. I hope students will give at least some thought to it before Thanksgiving break. Okay. All right, look, looking at freedom of religion, your class notes for lecture 23 begin with the Virginia statute for establishing religious freedom, going back to the year 1786. Both Madison and Jefferson were in on the composition of this state law for the state of Virginia, which has been quite influential in buttressing a separationist view of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Now, people will tell you Madison and Jefferson's religious views were not necessarily typical. Okay? They were deists, D-E-I-S-T. Okay? In other words, they believed God created the world and then left it alone, and subsequently has not had much interaction with the world. Had it been the 20th or 21st century instead of the 18th, people like Madison and Jefferson might have well turned out to be explicitly secular. But be that as it may, And the argument would be that their religious views were not necessarily typical of everyone at the time. Nevertheless, their views as key members of the founding generation were quite influential. So your class notes for Lecture 23 will begin with a discussion of the Virginia statute for establishing religious freedom going back to the year 1786. Now, we go through a number of major cases, including the West Virginia versus Barnett case in 1943, involving the flag salute controversy. This case involved members of the Jehovah's Witnesses sect who did not wish to be compelled or have their children compelled in class to say the Pledge of Allegiance, which they held to be tantamount to a prayer. Okay. When the court got this case the first time around, got this issue, they found for the school boards and boards of education that wanted to require the Pledge of Allegiance. Really, the West Virginia versus Barnett case was the second time around, and here they find for religious dissenters who do not wish to be compelled to say the Pledge of Allegiance in class. Justice Felix Frankfurter, who himself was Jewish and might have been felt to run afoul, he or his people might have, of requirements or establishments imposed by predominantly Christian jurisdictions, insisted nevertheless that on his understanding of the Constitution, he did not feel it was his place to tell a school board or state board of education what they could or could not do about such a thing. He was inclined to let them go ahead and require the Pledge of Allegiance to be said in class if they wanted to. But his views did not prevail in the case of West Virginia versus Barnett, 1943. The controversy is over to what extent we should accommodate religious beliefs. One example of a case in which religious beliefs were accommodated was Wisconsin versus Yoder, 1972. Now, in this case, the Amish people in Wisconsin did not wish their children to be subject to the compulsory education laws beyond the elementary grades, because they felt otherwise the Amish way of life might not survive. They traditionally have educated their children at home. Okay? And the court found for the Amish people in the case of Wisconsin versus Yoder, 1972. Now, Employment Division versus Smith comes along in 1990. And this involved some Native American people in Oregon who wished to use peyote, which generally is a restricted substance, considered a kind of a narcotic or a drug of abuse. But these people wished to use this substance in religious ceremonies. And what the court's ruling in Employment Division versus Smith was that in this case, you could not invoke religion for the case of getting out from under a generally applicable law. Okay. Religious beliefs do not necessarily exempt you from generally applicable laws. Okay. Well, the thing about it is, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Okay. Sometimes we have accommodated religious believers on these and similar matters, and sometimes we have not. In this case, the Supreme Court did not. It was enough of a provocation that Congress passed a couple of years later the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, in which Congress sought to be more accommodating of religious beliefs. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was in response to Employment Division versus Smith. Now, the thing about it is a principle whichever way it cuts. Okay? And sometimes these principles are invoked in behalf of people we might be sympathetic with, but in other cases, in behalf of people we might not be. Okay, so it depends on whose ox is being gored, you might say, and which slice of the bread is being buttered, if you'll forgive me a few mixed metaphors. The issue comes up again in the case of Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, 2014. All of us are familiar with Hobby Lobby stores. Well, the owners of that company, it's a family-held company, were evangelical Christians. And what they objected to was, under, I believe, the Obamacare legislation, employers were required to pay for certain contraceptive products for their female employees. And the owners of Hobby Lobby felt that some of these products were, in their use, were tantamount to abortion and wished not to have to pay for that or to provide them to their employees. And the court, in this case, found for Hobby Lobby. Although one interesting aspect of the case was they found not in favor of the owners of the company as individuals, but the company itself as a corporation. So they were conferring, shall we say, free exercise rights on a corporation. So can a corporation have free exercise rights? So that was a controversial aspect of the case. But be that as it may, the Supreme Court found for Hobby Lobby and its owners in the case of Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, 2014. Now you'll notice a series of cases, very, very interesting, puzzling, confounding cases for the Supreme Court, dealing with matters such as what kind of decorations may be put outside a public building, a government building, at Christmas time. This is a matter about which the court has gone around and around and around and left itself open to a good deal of criticism through the years. So take a look at those cases and see what you think of them. Similar issues arise about Sunday closing laws. All right, that is what we find in the class notes for Lecture 23. Now everyone, as you move to Lecture 24, you have cases that involve issues that arise with regard to the relation between religion and public education. And what I might say about this, everybody, is all these cases are under pressure because the Supreme Court, with the 3 justices added who were appointed by President Trump, seems determined to go in a more religion-friendly direction and to interpret the Establishment Clause in a more accommodationist rather than separationist way. Okay. Now, you have a list of cases going back for decades. The issue is, under a separationist interpretation of the Establishment Clause, okay, public education has to be secular. Okay. Well, there are parents who would like to give their children their religious education along with their general education, which you could do in a private or parochial school. But you would have to pay tuition for that, which would not be the case with public schools. Okay. Now, you notice a number of things that different jurisdictions have attempted through the years. And up until recently, okay, in the post-World War II era, the Supreme Court has been pretty consistent about striking all that stuff down and enforcing a rather strict separationist view of the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause with respect to the relation between religion and education. Whether a parent can use taxpayer funds to send a child to a school in which that child would receive religious education along with general education. And there's also the issue of what to do about jurisdictions who wish to provide for some sort of prayer at the beginning of the school day. Now, the major precedent on that raised quite a stink at the time that it was handed down was Engel versus Vitale, 1962. That is the one that is known as the school prayer decision. Now, what we have to be careful about is, some wag once said, as long as there are exams, there will be prayer in schools. But in this particular case, the New York State Board of Education, I think they called it the Board of Regents, had written the text of a prayer that was to be said at the beginning of the school day. And the Supreme Court struck that down. And that was known as the school prayer decision. And to its opponents, it was a matter of the Supreme Court kicking God out of the public schools. Now, again, what I would emphasize is as you look at these precedents that are discussed in the class notes for Lecture 24, we need to keep in mind that these are all under pressure. And we may expect that in the years to come, the Supreme Court may take a more religion-friendly, more accommodationist, and less separationist view of these issues. Now, at the very end of the class notes for Lecture 24, you have a couple of decisions that have been handed down in just the past couple of years. Kennedy versus Bremerton. Kennedy versus Bremerton involved a football coach who wanted to pray on the field at the end of a football game. And you can take a look at what the Supreme Court did with that going back to 2022. Then there's the case we'll be looking at for our quiz on Thursday, Mahmoud versus Taylor from just a few months ago. Now this is, in this case, the Montgomery County Board of Education in Maryland, which is a big school board of education in the D.C. suburbs in the state of Maryland. The Supreme Court told them they had to give an opt-out to parents who did not want their children included in instruction that included LGBTQ themes. Okay, they had to give them the opt-out. They had to let them opt their children out. And we'd be looking at some different views on that matter for the quiz on Thursday. A couple of articles I'll ask you to look at, and we sent you the links. If you have trouble bringing those up, contact me, but those links should be accessible. But those cases, Kennedy v. Bremerton and Mahmoud v. Taylor, are perhaps indicative of the direction the court is going to go in the future on these issues. All right, well, that's quite a bit to chew over then. So, freedom of religion on the syllabus for this week. Quiz on Thursday, 2 articles to look at. 10 true false items, 10 minutes to take the quiz. So, freedom of religion this week, and then before and after Thanksgiving, we will have equal protection issues, 14th Amendment issues, largely racial discrimination related issues to finish up the term. And then we will do a quiz this week, a discussion the following week, and then after the 1st of December, the last week of school, we'll have a quiz and discussion that week to finish up the term. So, take a look at this material on freedom of religion, study hard. We'll talk to you about a week from now at this time.